title is The Irreconcilable Reconciled. And the reason for the title I'll come on to in a minute. But it's, the objectives I've changed a little bit to understand what a US physician wants from a staging classification rather than a North American physician. Understand what an African Cancer Registrar wants from a staging classification. And understand what will be new in the 8th edition of TNM and how both a US physician and the Cancer Registrar in Africa can be satisfied. I have no financial conflicts. I have other conflicts that I'll come on to as we go along. So around Christmas time, we got the rota for both these rounds and for on call, and I had conflicts, so I moved them both. I thought I moved them both to June. And then I got a reminder about today's date, and I thought, no, that's wrong, I changed it. And I left it for a couple of days, thinking in my mind that I wasn't doing it until June. And then I thought, well, actually, I don't have a conflict that day, so perhaps it's right. So suddenly you realised that I was actually doing rounds today. And I was actually in what I still unfortunately call the GI check film rounds, although we haven't had check films for more than a decade. But I was talking to Bernard about this, and he said, well, have you thought about a title? And I said, I was thinking I might update what I talked at the week before at CER, which was about staging globally, and also about the agreements we came between the UICC and the AJCC, and call it the Reconciling the Irreconcilable. And he said, well, why don't you call it the Irreconcilable Reconciled? It sounds much better. So if at the end of this you don't think I've proved that we've reconciled the irreconcilable, sue Dr. Cummings, not me. His title. He also asked me what I was going to talk about. So I said I would sort of update the talk I gave at CER and put additional things in that. But I also told him, because I know his interest in classic art, that I have a very nice slide of Bruegel's The Tower of Babel. And he said, oh, I remember that from last time. So that meant that I had to actually make sure I put something new in. But fortunately, none of you have memories like Dr. Cummings, and won't actually remember what I talked about last time. So as I said, the reason why I couldn't do this talk in March was I was talking at the CER annual meeting about TNM and UICC. For those of you who don't know what CER is a branch of the National Cancer Institute in the US, and it stands for Surveillance, Epidemiology and End Results. And they collect and publish cancer incidence and survival data for about 30% of the US population. But it is population-based. It's the only population-based cancer registry service in the US. This is the map of the registries. Some are whole states, some, like California, partly funded by CER and partly by CDC. The Seattle region, but not the whole of Washington State, for instance. I think this is Detroit. But despite this map mainly being uncovered, it's still 30% of the US population. Unlike other registries that I'll come on to, like the NCDB, which is not population-based. So as I said, they collect information on demographics, tumour site, morphology, like any cancer registry, stage at diagnosis, using both TNM and their own extent of disease, which has been in existence for a long time. And I'll come on to what extent of disease is and how it differs from TNM. Details about the first course of treatment and follow-up statistics, mainly death and survival data. They haven't started collecting recurrence data, but they hope to in the future. Extent of disease is somewhat simplified way of collecting the anatomical extent of disease. They collect whether it's local, regional, or distant. And for people like physicians like us who are used to TNM, that sounds very similar in that stage 1 and 2 is usually local, 3 regional, 4 distant. But their definition of regional is different, and they're not necessarily comparable. For instance, in rectal cancer, T4 we would consider to be localized in TNM, but they consider to be regional. There's a whole industry of analyzing SEER data. It's a bit like the industry that seems to exist now on doing meta-analyses. This is a paper that I use when I talk about pancreatic cancer, which I'll probably talk about next time because I think you probably have heard enough about staging from me on these rounds. But this is a series of 2,500 patients who had adjuvant radiation or no radiation. And as I said, it's population-based, which is a huge advantage, but it's not complete. And the disadvantage, obviously, with population-based analyses is you can get very large numbers, which means it's easy to find a highly significant difference. This is the benefit in survival from adjuvant radiation. But as you see, it's highly significant, but not necessarily clinically significant. So there's a lot of data, papers being analysed using SEER data. The other organisation that is involved with TNM in the US and collecting and defining really stage data is the AJCC. And this is my first conflict because I'm the chair of the Education and Promotions Committee of the AJCC. These two statements are from their website, but despite being the chairman of that committee, this isn't my. I didn't come up with these phrases. That they had an outside. Thank you, outside marketer. So the AJCC, we help the world understand cancer. Not quite sure what that means. And the American Joint Committee on Cancer established the way cancer is communicated. And I don't know what that means either. But importantly, on the website, they also say that evidence-based anatomic staging continues to be the critical factor to understand cancer and treating patients. And this is really important because this is what they say on the website, but it's not necessarily what they do. Because they also say that new breakthroughs in oncology, not oncologic, are opening up ever more promising possibilities for precisely defining a prognosis and recommending a treatment based on a patient's individual data. So really that's aiming more to the personalized individual, identifying for the individual the prognosis and the treatment using stage data. This is in contrast to SEER, which is a surveillance organization, and looking at population-based data. So this is really the conflict between what is needed for the individual in an era of personalized medicine and the surveillance community who want simplified data that can be used across the board. So I said the SEER is the only population-based database. The other that you may hear about is the NCDB. Both the AJCC are really, and NCDB are really branches of the American College of Surgeons. The NCDB collects cancer registry data, but only from approved cancer centers. So it's not population-based. It's based on patients who get themselves to a recognized cancer center. This is a graph of the data of survival by stage group for colon cancer and rectal cancer. And the chair of the lower GI tract, or the hindgut, as it used to be called, is one of the few people, certainly chairs of AJCC task forces, who has knowledge and of SEER and has a surveillance interest, as well as personalized medicine interest. So, and this is important because, as you can see here, this is stage 2C, which is a T4N0 rectal cancer, so locally advanced but no nodes. The survival is worse than if you've got 3A, which is hidden under here, which is a T1N1, so small tumour with one lymph node involved. So if you're just looking at prognosis, you would, and this is what some sites have done, this is a proposal for prostate is to do this, is to change this so this goes neatly down. So you would change the T1N1 from a stage 3 to stage 2, and the T4N0, which is stage 2, localized disease, to stage 3. And that helps you with the prognosis. But for people like us who treat colorectal cancer, it's irrelevant for treatment. All we want to know is if there's a lymph node involved, because then they have chemotherapy. So the only decision making is whether it's lymph node positive or not. But if you change the localized disease, so if you change the T4 to stage 3, it means that you can't do backward comparisons. You can't see how your stage 3 is doing now compared to how it was doing 10 years ago. See if there's an advance, because stage 3 now is not the same as stage 3 it was the last edition. So the surveillance community likes stability, whilst the personalized medicine group like change, because they want to update things and have things improved and improve surveillance, improve prognosis and treatment information. But is TNM stage group the best way of doing that? So as I said, the clinician and patient interaction needs are different from the surveillance community. So CER, we talked about AJC, we talked about, and the CDC, which also have cancer registries, developed in 2002 something that was initially called collaborative stage, but the outcome of collaborative stage was still TNM. So it's really, and they changed the name to the collaborative stage data collecting system. It's really a way of collecting the raw data. And so the raw data that determines stage is collected and allows for backward compatibility. You can compare TNM 7th edition with 5th edition, and you can compare it with CER extent of disease, so because you have all the raw data there. And you can also collect additional site-specific factors, such as in breast cancer, ER, PR, HER2 new status. So that's all collected as well. So it had a lot of advantages because you collected the raw data, you collected the prognostic factors, but it became far too complex and far too expensive. And so they decided to pull the plug on it in 2016. That was a problem because the new edition of TNM is due out in January of next year, 2017. So they had a year's gap. So they decided to collect TNM data. Because of complexities and agreements and all sorts of reasons, the NCI and CER decided rather than collect AJCC TNM, they'd collect UICC TNM, which didn't go down very well with the AJCC, but it was good for us at the UICC. In Canada, we being me and Darlene and Gina and the cancer staging executive, were very sensible and decided we'll keep on doing collaborative stage until 2017 and when we have to change. So it hasn't been so much of a crisis here in Canada. But there's still a bit of doubt about how and the mechanisms are going to be to collect stage data for CER, CDC and the central registries when they change over to the 8th edition next year. So I've talked a bit about CER and AJCC. This is a slide some of you, or most of you, have seen before, but I have updated it with the UICC logo. The UICC TNM goes back to the 40s, and it was devised by a French surgeon called Pieter, who set up the UICC committee on clinical stage as well. But he really instigated TNM, and in the 50s there were proposals for breast and larynx, and then 26 sites in the 60s. The second committee was chaired by Alf Sellers, who was an epidemiologist in Toronto from the OC, thank you, Fifi, the forerunner of CCO. So here in Canada, and particularly in Toronto, we've been heavily involved with the UICC TNM almost since its inception. It wasn't until 1977 that the AJCC produced their own manual of staging, and 10 years later we had an agreement so that AJCC and UICC TNM will be as close as possible, if not identical. The TNM core group at UICC consists of Mary and I as co-chairs. Brian is also on the committee. But despite a heavy influence from Toronto, it really is small but international, with representatives from China and Japan, the US, other areas in Europe and South Africa as well. We are small, but we do have representatives from what we call the Global Advisory Group, which consists of many countries who have their own TNM committees, such as Canada, but we actually now cover 59% of the world population. So we have input from many countries across the globe. There's a query mark over South America because South America is represented by South American group of medical oncologists rather than individual countries. And I've no idea why on this map Tasmania has a different colour to everywhere else. We also have representatives from other organisations from the world interested in surveillance and cancer staging and cancer registries. WHO, who are producing ICD-11, and I'm involved with trying to get stage incorporated into that. The International Agency for Research in Cancer, International Association of Cancer Registries, AJCC, FIGO, CDC, International Agency for the Study of Lung Cancer, a new group called the International Collaboration on Cancer Reporting, which is an organization of 5 international pathology groups, so American, Canadian, Australasian, UK and European societies of pathology. In the beginning of each UICC book, we give the objectives of staging, which are sort of outlined as they've been going on so far, is to aid planning of treatment, give some indication of prognosis, assist the evaluation of results of treatment, facilitate the exchange of information and aid research, contribute to research. And we added, although we knew this was important, but hadn't actually been written down, to support cancer control activities. And this is acknowledged, for instance, with WHO, when they're talking about developing cancer registers across the world, the importance of collecting stage data, because stage data is central to determine cancer burden, as it provides information on the cancer burden globally. So I've shown this before. Up until mid-2000s in Ontario, we didn't have population-based cancer stage. The Cancer Registry in Ontario only collects stage data from the cancer centres. So if you had radiation, if you had a rectal cancer, had radiation at Princess Margaret, the data was collected. But if you had colon cancer and had surgery and chemotherapy at Mount Sinai, it wasn't collected because Mount Sinai is not a cancer centre. So the patient had to visit a cancer centre. So in 2000, mid-2000s, decided to collect population-based stage cancer data. And because we can do that now in Ontario, we get population-based data. So this is the year 2008 when Ontario, although screening for colorectal cancer had been in existence, it hadn't been a systematic process. But in 2008 it became one, because we now have population-based data, we could say at the beginning of this, 20% of patients with colorectal cancer at diagnosis in Ontario had stage 4 disease. Hopefully, obviously, with screening, this will drop. Also, if you have stage data, you can look at the distribution, for instance, if this is lung cancer by stage across the various regions in Ontario. This is the use of various treatment guidelines in the regions for stage 3A and 3B lung cancer. So you can see a variation across the province in how CCO guidelines are actually used. And this is survival by stage. So you can look at the various survival of by stage across the region. So if you have stage data, you can make much more use of surveillance data than if you didn't have stage data. So we can look at using stage data at outcome and burden in Ontario, but can we do that internationally? And there was a concern in the UK that patients with cancer didn't do as well as elsewhere. So the International Cancer Benchmarking Partnership was started, and this was obtaining surveillance data from the UK, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Canada, and Australia, and looked at survival between 1995 and 2007. These 6 areas were used because they had sort of comparable socialized healthcare systems. And they looked at relative survival, and unfortunately the UK was the lowest. But that could be because patients were presenting late with advanced disease, and therefore they weren't going to do so well. So you had to have stage data. So that was the next step, was to look at the stage of these patients. Unfortunately, only 50% of the cancer registers they'd used actually had stage data. So at this time period, Ontario was included initially for survival, but not staged, because at that time we didn't have population-based stage data. So all the Ontario data had to be dropped when it came to the next part of the analysis. So that was to look at stage. The problem was that nobody was speaking the same language when it came to stage. So this is where the previous Tower of Babel came from. This is an older Tower of Babel, not quite so impressive, but so it turned out that some cancer registers were using the 5th edition of TNM, some used 6, some were using 7. Others used Jukes for colorectal cancer, others in Gynae were using FIGO, some were using TNM. In Norway, they had their own localized regional distant. In New South Wales, they had another localized regional and distant, one of which was SEER and one was a homegrown one, and I can't remember which is which. But it meant that everybody was using different systems. In the UK, for reasons known to themselves, the UK pathologists refused to use anything other than the 5th edition of TNM for colorectal cancer. In Japan, I know Japan wasn't part of this, but in Japan, there's a series of cancer committees, breast cancer committee, for instance, and I was at the meeting of the Japanese Cancer Society, and the breast group presented their data looking at survival and comparing how TNM predicted survival, UICC TNM, compared to their own breast staging system. And the TNM did much better. So I was expecting the conclusion to be, oh, we'll move to TNM like other groups do, but no, the conclusion was we need to improve the Japanese system. Anyway, as I said, the next part of this was try and merge these different staging systems so they could use it. So they did a lot of hard work sort of trying to compare and link up TNM 7th edition with SEER summary stage, for instance. And I gave you examples of colorectal cancer. This is lung cancer. And again, similar sort of thing. What they call regional is not what TNM calls regional. So I was involved with writing a paper discussing the problems with staging, and this was the sentence I put in the conclusions, was comparative research would be facilitated if clinicians adhered to a common staging system, such as TNM. That was my bit. Thank you. It meant that I could put my name to the authorship, so that was my only... Anyway, TNM should remain simple enough for epidemiological research, and UICC should examine how mapping from TNM to localized, regional and distant systems could be made explicit and standardized for all cancers. And I'll go on to how we're doing that in a minute. So this is their results for breast cancer by stage. This is the UK, and you can see for one, it does as well as everybody else, nearly 100%. But when it comes to stage 4, the UK is down here. To my horror, because I wasn't involved in this paper, when they did the colorectal data, they referred to Duke stage rather than TNM, although it's... so this is stage 4, and again, I'm afraid the UK do worse. So, as I said earlier, we want in surveillance this ability to compare, and changing in systems makes things complicated. So if, although the prognosis for 3A is better than 2C in rectal cancer, if that was changed, it would make the backward comparability or comparability across jurisdictions, because not everybody can change to the 8th edition when the 8th edition becomes in place. It takes a lot of time to get that information out. People use different technologies to collect the data. So it takes time to change. So even if everybody changed, some people may change next year, some may change 3 years later. So you still have the problems of comparability if people are using different systems or if something fundamental changes. So this is a map of the US. We'll come back to that, Pieter. So, when go to the AJCC, you hear, I'm the only non-US physician who goes to the AJCC meetings, but you always hear that there's a risk that TNM is becoming redundant, that it's already redundant in breast cancer, for instance, because in the US, everybody has early breast cancer and therefore extent of disease is irrelevant. And that markers such as HER2/neu is far more important in prostate, Gleason and PSA, HPV and oropharynx. And again, going back to breast cancer, gene expression profiling is more important than the extent of disease and TNM. And TNM is becoming redundant. This is from Brian, and this is actually a summary of biomarkers from Nature paper back in 2011. Even back in 2011, there were 150,000 documented claimed biomarkers, of which only, and I'm sure, I mean, that's gone up logarithmically since then. Only 100 are used routinely in the clinic, and I suspect that number hasn't changed a huge amount. Important things like gene expression profiling, such as Oncotype DX, is very important, and obviously very important with the individual physician-patient interaction. But it still depends on the extent of disease. It's really used for, as far as I understand, because I don't do breast cancer, as you know. So it's only relevant to lymph node negative patients who are ER positive. So it's still important to know the extent, anatomical extent of disease is still important. And if you want individual information, there are tools online, such as Adjuvant Online. This is a new one from the Mayo for colorectal cancer, where you add in performance status, BMI, but you still have to add in the extent of disease. So you have to add in the number of lymph nodes are positive, so you put in the, and also it says tumor stage, but it means tumor category. So the T category of the before, and then you put in the type of treatment, and then you can calculate the results. But they still rely on anatomical extent of disease. And it's not really true from what the AJCC surgeons tell me that all US patients have early breast cancer. This is our own data from Ontario showing 40% of patients in breast cancer, admittedly in 2009, had stage 1 disease. But this is the latest SEER data from 2005 to 2011, which shows that only 40% of patients had tumour that was not localized to the breast. So anatomic central disease is still important. At the moment, when you look at breast cancer staging, it is still purely anatomical central disease, unlike prostate, where PSA and Gleason is added. There is a proposal from the AJCC to add grade, HER2 new status, ER and PR into this. So you'd have a very long table with I counted it 66 different permutations, and that would be the stage grouping. I don't think that is very feasible. I don't think anybody would remember it, but that's where you could use an electronic tool. But obviously that is of no use whatsoever to the surveillance community who want to know the extent of disease in a simple, recordable fashion. I think I've said this really. So, but if you did that system where you put in everything and you had stage grouping, you'd have, for instance, stage 2B could either be a locally advanced tumour, but low grade, all receptors positive, and that could have the same prognosis as a very small tumour, but everything negative. And they'd both be called stage 2B. So it may help you in determining prognosis, but it's of no value in determining what the treatment should be for that individual patient. So I think it's important to keep anatomical extent of disease from prognostic grouping when you're adding in other biomarkers. So anatomical extent of disease, or we've decided in UICC for the next edition, just call that stage, because that's what people understand by stage, is the anatomical extent of disease. And use the term prognostic group for when other additional prognostic factors are included into the extent of disease. I think I've said this. So, I think I've said this as well. So, going back to one of the conclusions of the benchmarking staging project is that the UICC should work on how to map TNM to extent of disease. We and UICC have been working with IARC and NCI, particularly Brian and I, looking at something we've called essential TNM. And the reason for that is obviously we need to keep TNM globally relevant, but not everywhere has enough data to collect TNM. And so stage data isn't collected, and it needs to be collected. For instance, in prostate cancer, it's rapidly growing in Africa, but we don't know, is it locally advanced prostate cancer, as you might expect if we look at the locally advanced prostate cancer seen in North Americans of African descent, or is it because the wealthier countries are introducing PSA and diagnosing early cancer? We just don't know. So we need to be able to determine that. So what we decided to do was to simplify it and perhaps start backwards. At one point we decided to call it MNT, but that was too confusing. So we decided to call it essential TNM. And what the cancer registrar does is start off with the patient chart. Are there metastases? If there are metastases, then they stop. So this is the incidence of prostate cancer. You can see high in North America, Europe, high in South Africa. This is Zimbabwe, where it's increasing, and this is the Gold Coast, where it still remains low. So you start off by asking the question, are there metastases? If the answer is yes, then you stop. So because then you know it's stage 4 disease, and you stop. If there are no metastases, then the registrar says, is there evidence for nodal disease? And if there is, then you stop, because then it's stage 3 and regional. If it's through the bowel wall, then you look to see the extent of the bowel wall, if you know that. So the cancer registrar just starts off with a single page and does metastasis, ticks, yes, stop. It's a bit more complicated for cervix, but it's still the same thing happens. Are there metastases? Yes, stop. Are there nodes? Now, in some countries such as the Gold Coast, which is French Africa, they use FIGO, so they don't know the nodal status.
The Ivory Coast, I think they call it.
Ivory Coast, the Ivory Coast.
Not Gold Coast. He said Australia.
I know. I put Gold Coast there as well. I'm in the Ivory Coast. Well, I've got to make a mistake. I'm not perfect.
I think they want to call it Côte d'Ivoire.
Yeah, well, I can't say that. I have difficulty enough with English sometimes, so I can't use French. I forgot what I was going to say, but no. So, we have tested this so far in 3 places. The Ivory Coast, can you pronounce that for me, Brian?
Abidjan.
Thank you. Georgia, I can say that. And Harare, which Brian didn't know where Harare was, so I have to get my own back. In Zimbabwe. So we tested it in these 3 places so far, and the reports have been very favourable.
Why Georgia?
Third world country.
So says the Americans.
So, Georgia, because the NCI representative is in charge of the Georgia Cancer Registry. But he's also worked in Jordan as well. So when I was introduced to him first, somebody said he's experienced in Jordan, somebody said he's experienced in Georgia, and I misheard the two. And I wasn't sure which, and turned out to be both. But because of his experience in Jordan, he does have an understanding of the global needs of cancer registry. But he is now the head of the cancer registry, the CER registry in Georgia. And we've changed, it's been translated into French as well, for use in French Africa. So that's one way that, and we're going to be putting this in the new TNM book. So when you get your new TNM book, you'll see little diagrams such as that, so you can do essential TNM, but you don't have to do that. The other thing that is missing, and this is again important in the global surveillance community, is staging in pediatrics. TNM, UICC, AJCC only is relevant for adults. We have avoided pediatric staging. One of the reasons for that is there are a number of different staging systems available, and there's always, everybody wants to use their own. But obviously that is of no value in the global surveillance community where you want to use the same system. So CEOP, the International Society for Pediatric Oncology, I won't try and pronounce the proper French title, had its annual meeting in Toronto in 2014, and there was a consensus meeting on pediatric staging. It was multinational, involved NCI, UICC, IIIA, and others. And published a paper in Lancet Oncology 1st of April, not April Fool's Day. And it's entitled Recording Pediatric Cancer Stage in Population-Based Cancer Registries, the Toronto Consensus Principles and Guidelines. Used a modified Delphi approach, multiple stakeholders from high-income, low-middle-income countries, pediatricians, epidemiologists, and 2 adult radiation oncologists. That's Mary and I, if you want to. So, really came out with guidelines of what staging system should be used, but also not just what staging system should be used, but if in low middle income countries you didn't have, like essential TNM, sufficient data to collect TNM, that was a simplified method. So this is just a table looking at Hodgkin's lymphoma. Decision was to use Ann Arbor, and then you can divide that into limited or advanced. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, apparently they don't use that Ann Arbor, they use some Jude Murphy. I'm not sure what that is, but again, you can divide it into limited and advanced if you don't have the details wounds, they usually give preoperative treatment, but you can still use a Y TNM just as we do in rectal cancer. Y is the prefix used for if you give preoperative treatment for the pathological stage. Rhabdomyosarcoma will use TNM, etc. But again, you can divide into localized metastatic or localized regional metastatic, so a bit like the extent of disease, but different terminology. So the future of TNM, I believe, remains relevant. It's essential for patient care. It's an important component of cancer registries, facilitates cancer control, allows cross-jurisdictional comparison, but it's important for ease of collection of data for cancer surveillance. In the 8th edition, we're going to, in UICC, we're going to going to use the term stage just for purely anatomical extent of disease, prognostic group or grouping when other factors are added like ER, PR, HER2/neu, or in prostate, PSA and Gleason, except it's no longer being called Gleason, I'm told. We're going to have essential TNM in there, and we're also going to have pediatric staging. And I think last time Brian gave rounds, he talked about prognostic factors and biomarkers, but also we're going to put in the prognostic grids, and these you can find in the Manual of Clinical Oncology, which I'm coming on to in a minute. Can't spell. So, reconciling the irreconcilable. As I said, if you think this title is a misrepresentation of what I talked about, sue Bernard, not me. But it's really not possible to reconcile the irreconcilable by definition. But I hope you've been able to understand the different needs of the individual patient and physician interaction and the surveillance community. I think it's important to keep stage as a description of anatomic extent of disease. It's needed for surveillance. It's still essential in the majority of cancers. In head and neck cancer, it's essential for most of them. With oropharynx, dividing into HPV positive, HPV negative, but beyond that, it's still going to be anatomic extent of disease. You can collect additional prognostic factors as necessary. So, Princess Margaret Cancer Registry, we collect TNM, but we also collect important markers such as ER/PR status, etc. If you feel there's a need and a requirement to develop prognostic groups for individual patient care and individual patient prognosis, that's still possible to do. So stage diagnosis for surveillance, you still need anatomic extent of disease, so you can do cross-sectional comparisons across jurisdictions. But if you want the data for the individual patient for prognosis, you can use a tool such as this, where you put in the extent of disease, other important prognostic factors such as performance status, and it calculates this risk of recurrence-free survival with confidence intervals. So tools like that exist, but they're not of any value for surveillance. So just finally, I'd like to thank really the whole of the UICC core group, particularly Brian, particularly with Essential TNM, and Mary, who is the co-chair with me, and also heavily involved with the prognostic and with the pediatric staging. I said I mentioned the UICC Manual of Clinical Oncology. This is a book that Brian edited, but a lot of people here and throughout the hospital were involved as contributors, and there's going to be a launch with light lunch, free raffle for 3 books, organised by 2 books. It's 3 if Brian volunteers to pick one. Next Friday in the 7th floor auditorium. And this is just a reminder that spring is coming this weekend.